Could you not afford a decent black dress? Jasmine's shrill voice sliced right through the dead silence of the cemetery. She wore a designer black silk dress. Her fingernails painted a bleeding red, pointed straight at the ribbons pinned to the chest of my Marine Corps dress blues. Relax, Sophie, she sneered. You are not in a combat zone. I know you are always desperate for attention, but this is Dad's funeral. Do not turn it into a circus. Behind her, a pack of relatives stifled their giggles. Right there at the edge of my own father's grave, I stood completely isolated. They had no idea. Just hours before catching this flight, I was draping the stars and stripes over the caskets of 2 young Marines under my command. I had chewed the inside of my cheek raw to keep from breaking down over my dead squad. Now the people sharing my blood were treating me like trailer park trash. But before I tell you exactly how this cheap uniform became the death sentence that buried my arrogant brother-in-law's entire career, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the absolute hellfire that dropped in that wake is something nobody saw coming. The giggles faded, swallowed by the heavy rhythmic thud of wet dirt hitting the wooden lid of the casket. Thud, thud, chunks of black mud splattering over polished mahogany. I stood there, frozen. Not a single muscle in my jaw twitched. My eyes tracked the gravediggers, evaluating their movements out of pure habit. Jasmine did not even wait for the hole to be filled. She spun on her stiletto heels and marched away. The rest of the flock followed her lead instantly. Designer shoes crunching on the gravel, a parade of false grief heading for the imported wine waiting at the house. They left me standing alone at the edge of a 6-foot drop. I looked down. I brushed a speck of dust off the red blood stripe running down the leg of my trousers. The fabric was crisp, perfectly aligned. I executed a precise about-face, my leather heel snapping against the pavement, and walked to the parking lot. I did not look back. Not once. The rental car was a beaten-up Ford SUV. It smelled like stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine air freshener. I grabbed the rusted door handle. Before I could pull it open, a sharp buzz vibrated against my ribs. Buzz, my phone, tucked in my breast pocket. I pulled it out. The screen was cracked in the top right corner, a text message from my mother. When you get to the mansion for the wake, find a quiet corner to stand in. Ethan has important partners coming over. Do not embarrass your sister. I stared at the glowing pixels. The glare of the midday sun beat down on the back of my neck. Not a single word asking if my flight was safe. Not a single word about the man we just put in the ground. Just an order: stay in the corner. Stay out of the way of Ethan's big-shot corporate buddies. Hide the uniform. My thumb hovered over the cracked glass. I felt the sharp edge of the splintered screen bite into my skin. I pressed hard enough to leave a deep indent. I locked the screen and tossed the piece of plastic onto the passenger seat. I slid into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut. The heavy clunk of metal sealed me in. I rested my forehead against the hot, cracked leather of the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, stared into the dark space behind my eyelids. The smell of the rental car faded. Suddenly, I was not in an Ohio cemetery parking lot anymore. I was back in the dirt. 3 years ago, the Middle East. The air in the bunker was suffocating, thick with the smell of diesel fuel, stale sweat, and cordite. The dim red tactical lights cast long bloody shadows against the concrete walls. I was sitting on an ammo crate, my hands coated in fine desert sand, holding a pen. I was signing the authorization form to transfer every single dime of my hazard pay directly into my mother's bank account. Dad needed the hospital bills paid. That same night, the sirens screamed. Incoming fire. Mortar shells hammered the earth above us. The concussions rattled my teeth and shook dust into my eyes. We held the line. I survived. The money cleared the bank the next morning. Not once in the 3 years that followed did my mother or sister call to ask if I was still breathing. They took the blood money. They used it to prop up their fake suburban royalty status. And now they wanted the grunt who paid for it all to stand in the corner like a stray dog. My eyes snapped open. The memory vanished. The heavy weight in my chest evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I sat up straight, shoulders squared, I reached into the hidden compartment of my duffel bag on the floorboard. I bypassed the civilian phone. I pulled out a heavy matte black device. Pentagon encryption, level 6 clearance. My thumbs moved over the keypad in rapid practice strikes. A direct, untraceable line to my lead intelligence officer. Extract all corporate files on Ethan's law firm. Current status on Department of Defense bidding. Project 132. Send immediately. Send. I shoved the device back into my bag. I jammed the key into the ignition. The V8 engine roared to life, a low guttural growl that shook the rusted frame of the SUV. I threw it into drive. I ripped out of the parking lot, the tires spitting gravel. I was not hiding in a corner. I steered the heavy vehicle straight toward Jasmine's gated community. They wanted to treat me like a grunt. Fine. The civilian war had just opened its front doors. I pushed open the heavy oak door. The blast of centralized air conditioning hit me first. It carried the sharp, overpowering scent of Tom Ford cologne and expensive catering. It choked out whatever faint smell of funeral incense and cemetery dirt still clung to my boots. Jasmine's house was massive. Vaulted ceilings, hardwood floors polished so bright they looked like glass. Everywhere I looked, there were massive arrangements of white orchids, dozens of them. They looked like a luxury showroom, not a memorial. My family milled around in designer black dresses and tailored Italian suits. They held crystal glasses filled with dark red wine. Ice clinked against glass. Loud, easy laughter echoed off the high walls. This was not a wake. This was a country club networking event. A waiter in a crisp white shirt walked past carrying a silver tray. He locked eyes with me. He looked at my dark blue uniform, the red blood stripe running down my leg, the brass buttons. He blinked, pulled the silver tray tight to his chest, and quickly stepped back, like I was carrying an infectious disease. I walked past him. I found an empty corner near the large bay windows. Out of the way. Exactly where my mother ordered me to stand. I planted my boots shoulder-width apart. I clasped my hands behind my back, resting them flat at the base of my spine. Parade rest. I locked my jaw. I scanned the room. Target acquisition. My eyes found Jasmine. She stood dead center in the living room, holding court. 3 corporate executives in sharp gray suits surrounded her. She held a silk handkerchief. She dabbed at the corner of her eyes. Her eyes were completely dry. "It was just so incredibly hard," Jasmine said. Her voice carried easily over the soft jazz music playing from the hidden ceiling speakers. The sleepless nights. I sat by Dad's bed for weeks. I had to hire private nurses out of my own pocket just to make sure he had the absolute best care. Ethan and I spared no expense. She took a slow sip of her wine. The executives nodded. They looked deeply impressed. She was playing the perfect, grieving, wealthy daughter. I dug my fingernails into the meat of my own palms. Not a single word. Not one mention of the blood money. 3 years of my hazard pay. Every single cent I earned taking mortar fire in the sandbox. The money I transferred from a dark bunker while the ground shook above my head. It went straight to the hospital. Straight to her account. She used my combat pay to buy these white orchids. She used my sweat to buy this expensive wine. And now she was wearing the credit like a shiny badge of honor. The muscles in my neck pulled tight like steel cables. A familiar voice cut through the noise of the party. Brigadier General Thomas Vance. We were standing in the burning heat of Fallujah when he said it. "Listen to me, Lewis." His gravelly voice echoed in my memory. "In the Marine Corps, loyalty is written in blood. Out there in the civilian world, it is written on sand. The first gust of selfish wind will blow it right away." He was right. I squared my shoulders. I pointed the toes of my leather dress shoes straight toward the heavy oak front door. I did not belong here. These people lived in a world built on smoke mirrors and credit cards, a world of fake tears and stolen valor. I lived in a world of brass casings, dirt, and absolute truths. I took a slow, deep breath through my nose. I let it out. The burning anger cooled. It froze over. It turned to ice. Let them have their cheap show. Then the crowd parted. Just a fraction. Someone stepped out from the long hallway. An old man. He did not fit in with the silk and the Rolex watches. He wore a faded, ill-fitting black suit. The fabric looked cheap, the shoulders sloped, but his posture was rigid. Pinned to his left lapel was a faded silver veteran pin. Master Sergeant Miller. He served with my father in the First Gulf War. He was the only person in this entire zip code who knew what mud and fear actually tasted like. Miller ignored the waiters. He ignored the executives. He started walking straight toward my corner, his heavy black shoes scuffed against the polished floor. As he got closer, his eyes narrowed. He looked at the dress blue jacket. He looked past the dark fabric. He looked at the colorful blocks of ribbons pinned tightly above my left breast pocket. His eyes tracked the medal, the bronze star, the combat action ribbon, the unit citations. He knew how to read the map of a soldier's life. Then his gaze moved up, to the silver eagle pinned to my collar. Miller stopped dead in his tracks, 3 feet away. The muscles in his jaw twitched. The color drained from his weathered face, then rushed right back. His hands curled into tight fists at his sides. He knew exactly what that eagle meant. Master Sergeant Miller stopped exactly 3 feet away from me. 3 feet, the precise ingrained regulation distance. He looked completely out of place in this massive vaulted living room. Around us, the air was thick with custom Italian wool, heavy gold watches, and pure arrogance. Miller was wearing a faded, off-the-rack black suit that looked like it had been sitting in a mothballed closet for a decade. The dark fabric was thin. The lapels were out of style. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way he carried himself. When he looked at me, the heavy slope of his old age vanished. His spine locked into a straight, rigid line. The ghosts of the Gulf War woke up in his eyes. He did not look at my face, not at first. His eyes locked onto the left side of my chest. To the civilians drinking imported wine in this room, the colorful fabric blocks pinned to my jacket were just cheap decorations. Pretty little squares. But Miller knew how to read them. He read the bronze star. He read the combat action ribbon. He saw the unit citations. He was reading the violent, bloody map of my last 15 years in the dirt. Then his eyes tracked upward, past the ribbons, past the dark blue fabric of the uniform. His gaze hit the collar. It hit the heavy silver eagle pinned flat against the fabric. Colonel. The air between us seemed to turn to concrete. The casual, obnoxious laughter from the kitchen faded into white noise. Absolute, unquestioning respect washed over the old veteran's face. His right hand twitched. His fingers curled inward, brushing the seam of his trousers, then flattened out sharp and tight. His elbow began to bend. He was pulling his arm up. Right here in the middle of this plastic suburban wake, he was about to snap a flawless textbook salute. The highest honor one soldier could give a commanding officer. He never got the chance. A heavy, suffocating wave of sour red wine and expensive perfume crashed into the space between us. Jasmine. She materialized out of the crowd like a bad wind. She shoved her way right through the quiet gap. Her sharp elbow caught Miller hard on the edge of his bicep. She pushed the old man aside without a single drop of hesitation, treating him like a piece of cheap furniture blocking her path. "Oh, Mr. Miller, you do not need to pay any attention to Sophie," Jasmine said. Her voice was shrill. It scraped against the inside of my skull. She was smiling, her lips painted a glossy bleeding red, but her eyes were cold and dead. She stepped directly into my personal space. She looked me up and down, her gaze scraping over the brass buttons of my dress blues with pure disgust. "She always loves playing dress-up," Jasmine sneered. She took a slow, deliberate sip from her crystal wine glass, leaving a greasy red smear on the rim. "Makes a huge scene out of those little soldier outfits. She thinks she's doing something important. I guess when you do not have a real career in the corporate world or a husband to take care of you, you have to find some way to feel special." The words hung in the air, heavy, toxic. She was standing in a house paid for by the blood I spilled in the sand. She was drinking wine bought with my combat hazard pay. And she was standing there in front of an audience of her wealthy, entitled friends, mocking the very uniform that kept the wolves away from her front door. Miller froze. The oxygen sucked completely out of the room. I watched the blood rush rapidly up his thick neck. His weathered face turned a dark, violent shade of red. The veins in his temples began to throb against his thin skin. his hands hanging at his sides curled into tight bone-white fists. The dry leather of his old shoes creaked as he shifted his weight forward. He opened his mouth. He drew in a sharp, ragged breath of air. He was going to explode. I could see the fuse burning down. He was going to rip her apart right there in front of the catered food and the white orchids. He was going to scream the truth about the silver eagle. He was going to tell this entire room of parasites exactly who they were talking to. I could not let that happen. I did not need an old man to fight my battles. I did not need to borrow his voice to validate my existence. And I certainly was not going to let him break military bearing for a woman who did not even know how to earn her own paycheck. I locked eyes with Miller, just for a fraction of a second. I gave him a hard, flat stare. I executed one rapid tactical blink. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny shake of my head. Stand down. It was not a request. It was a direct order from a commanding officer. Miller caught it. His jaw ground together so hard I could hear his teeth click. He swallowed the rage. It tasted like hot ash, but he swallowed it down. He closed his mouth. He took one slow, deliberate step back, falling back into line. He followed my order. Jasmine did not notice a single thing. She possessed zero situational awareness. She actually thought Miller stepping back was a victory. She thought she had scared the old veteran off with her sharp tongue. She flipped her hair over her shoulder in a gesture of pure, unadulterated arrogance. She turned her head and winked at a group of cousins holding champagne flutes by the kitchen island. They smirked back at her. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought I was a whipped dog taking a beating because I knew I was beneath them. Let them think it. Let them dig the hole as deep as they possibly could. The crowd of dark suits and silk dresses suddenly shifted. The massive bodies parted right down the middle, clearing a path. Heavy leather soles cracked against the polished wood floor. Ethan, the corporate defense lawyer. He walked through the gap with a half-empty glass of Pinot Noir resting casually in his right hand. His bespoke suit caught the overhead light. He stopped right next to his wife. He reached up with his free hand and pushed his gold-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose. He tilted his chin up, looking down at me through the expensive smudge-free lenses. The skirmish was over. The real war had just stepped onto the battlefield. Ethan stopped right in front of me. He stood entirely too close. He brought the heavy, suffocating smell of expensive hair pomade and fermented grapes right into my personal space. He wore a bespoke suit, charcoal gray. The fabric was immaculate, no wrinkles, no dust. It was the uniform of a man who had never done a single day of hard labor in his entire life. He held a crystal wineglass near his chest, his perfectly manicured fingernails tapping a careless rhythm against the delicate glass. He looked down his nose at me. He looked at the pressed blue fabric of my uniform. He looked at the ribbons. A smug, ugly little smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "So, Sophie," Ethan said. His voice was loud. He projected his words across the room because he wanted an audience. "What is it you actually do in the military, I mean on a day-to-day basis?" I did not answer. I kept my jaw locked shut. My hands remained clasped firmly behind my back. Ethan took a slow, theatrical sip of his wine. He swallowed loudly. "Do you drive supply trucks, or do you just manage the warehouse, handing out wool blankets and combat boots to the grunts?" A few people standing nearby chuckled. The sound grated against my eardrums like sandpaper. My relatives, people who shared my blood. They drifted closer, forming a loose half-circle around us. They crossed their arms. They tilted their heads. They wanted a show. They wanted to see the wealthy corporate lawyer put the military failure back in her place. Jasmine stepped up right next to her husband. She slid her hand onto his tailored shoulder. She leaned into him, her designer silk dress brushing loudly against his suit. "She probably teaches the new recruits how to scrub the toilets," Jasmine said. Her voice was high and piercing. It carried easily over the soft music playing in the living room. "Do not ask her the hard questions, Ethan. It is embarrassing. If she actually did anything that mattered, we would have seen her face on the news by now." Ethan laughed, a short, arrogant bark. He reached up and adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his corporate friends, soaking up their amusement. They were feeding off each other. They used me as a stepping stone, a prop, something to step on so they could feel taller. They built their entire suburban kingdom on fake prestige, and mocking my uniform was their favorite party trick. I shifted my gaze, past Ethan, past Jasmine. My mother sat on a massive white leather sofa near the stone fireplace. She held a cup of black coffee. Her fingers were covered in thick gold rings. She heard every single word. She saw the circle of people laughing at me. She did not stand up. She did not defend her own flesh and blood. Instead, she set her coffee cup down on the glass table. The porcelain clinked sharply against the glass. She let out a long, heavy sigh. The exact kind of sigh you give a disobedient, disappointing child. "Sophie, I have told you this 100 times," my mother said. Her voice was flat, completely empty of warmth. "You really should learn a thing or two from your sister. Look at the life she has built." Yuri, she gestured vaguely toward the vaulted ceiling, the imported white orchids, and the expensive caterers walking through the halls. "At your age, you should be settling down," my mother continued. "You should find a nice quiet job in a corporate office, make some real money, buy nice things. It is so much better than running around in the dirt, sleeping outside, and dealing with a bunch of uneducated, crude soldiers. You are throwing your life away for nothing. For nothing." 3 years ago, I sat in a pitch-black bunker. The ground was shaking so hard my teeth rattled inside my skull. I signed over every single penny of my combat hazard pay so she could pay the hospital bills, so my father could die in a clean bed instead of a state-funded county ward. She took the money. She spent it. And now she sat on a white leather sofa and called my sacrifice nothing. That was it. The final knife. She completely stripped away the last shred of dignity from the uniform I wore. She did not care about the friends I buried in the sand. She did not care about the mortar fire, the sleepless nights, or the blood I sweat to keep her comfortable. She only cared about the optics. I did not fit into her perfect, wealthy suburban picture frame. Therefore, I was garbage. The air inside my lungs turned to ash. The steady, disciplined rhythm of my heartbeat stopped. It shifted into something entirely different. A slow, heavy, violent thud. I felt the familiar coldness spread through my veins. The exact same coldness that takes over right before you call in an artillery strike on a hostile grid coordinate. The panic disappears. The emotion burns away. All that is left is the math, the pure mechanical calculation of destroying a target. The patience was gone. The tolerance was gone. The red line had been crossed. I stopped looking at the floor. I slowly raised my head. I looked straight into Ethan's eyes. I did not blink. The polite, quiet daughter vanished. The mask fell off. I gave him the 1,000-yard stare. The dead, empty, hollow look of a person who evaluates human life through a thermal sniper scope. Ethan's smirk faltered. Just a fraction of an inch. A bead of sweat suddenly formed at his temple. His fingers tightened around the stem of his crystal wine glass. He felt the sudden massive drop in the atmospheric pressure. He did not understand what was happening, but his primitive civilian survival instincts finally woke up. He realized he was standing in the exact same cage as a predator. I pulled my hands out from behind my back. The heavy brass buttons on my cuffs clinked together. I let my arms drop straight down to my sides, my fists uncurled. I relaxed my shoulders. I stepped out of the parade rest position. The casual noise in the living room seemed to instantly evaporate. The jazz music coming from the speakers sounded distant and muffled. I took one slow, deliberate step forward, right into Ethan's personal space. The hardwood floor did not even creak under my boots. A Category 5 hurricane was about to tear the roof off this house, and they did not even have the sense to run. I did not say a single word. I just looked at him. The silence stretched. It became heavy, uncomfortable. Ethan expected me to shrink. He expected me to look at the polished floor, mumble a quick apology, and walk away. That was what the family scapegoat was supposed to do. Play the role, take the beating. Keep the peace. I did not move an inch. I analyzed him. I looked past the expensive charcoal suit and the heavy gold watch on his wrist. I saw the drop of red wine gathering at the corner of his mouth. I saw the soft, unchallenged slope of his jaw. His posture was loose, weak. He stood with his weight shifted entirely to his right heel, leaving his center of gravity completely exposed. He was a soft civilian, A man who paid other people to cut his grass and wash his car. He had never taken a real punch in his entire life. He was fragile. The low murmurs in the living room died down. The relatives watching us shifted nervously on their feet. The soft jazz music playing from the ceiling speakers suddenly sounded entirely too loud. Ethan's confident smirk started to slip. Just a little. His eyes darted to Jasmine for a fraction of a second, seeking validation. He squeezed the stem of his wine glass. His knuckles turned bone white. He wanted me to break the silence. He needed me to break it because he did not know how to handle the dead air. People who talk for a living always hate the quiet. It makes them feel small. I finally opened my mouth. I kept my voice low. I did not yell. I did not raise my pitch. I dropped it. The tone was flat, hollow, and vibrating with the heavy cadence of a warning shot. Yes, I said. The single syllable cut through the room. Sometimes my job is exactly that, I continued. Each word snapped into place like a round feeding into a chamber. Sometimes my job is just keeping the wolves far enough away so you have the fundamental right to sit in this air-conditioned room, to drink your expensive wine, and to judge me. The words hit the floor like dead weight. Nobody laughed. The mocking chuckles from the cousins completely evaporated. The air in the massive living room turned to ice. Across the room, I heard a sharp intake of breath. My mother. Her mouth hung open. She stared at me, completely paralyzed. She expected the quiet, obedient daughter. She expected the silent ATM machine that paid the hospital bills from a dark bunker. She did not expect a cornered animal to turn around and bare its teeth. Ethan felt the shift in the room. He felt the eyes of his corporate partners burning into the back of his neck. His fragile ego took a massive public hit. A man who based his entire identity on dominating conference rooms could not stomach being dressed down by a woman in a uniform. Not in his own house, not in front of his audience. His face flushed. A dark, ugly red crept up his thick neck and stained his cheeks. He took a sudden half-step forward, closing the distance. He tried to reclaim the ground. He planted his left hand on his hip. He thrust his chest forward, mimicking dominance. It was the cheap, hollow posturing of a barroom bully. He pointed his crystal wine glass right at my face. The dark red liquid sloshed violently against the delicate rim, threatening to spill over onto his tailored lapel. "What is with that attitude, little girl?" Ethan growled. He dropped his voice. He was trying to sound dangerous. He just sounded desperate. "You think you can come into my house and talk down to me? You think putting on a cheap blue suit makes you a hero?" I did not blink. I stared right through the glass, right through him. "I know exactly how the real world works," Ethan spat. He took another step, leaning his face closer to mine. I could smell the fermented grapes and the stale coffee on his breath. "I deal with the Department of Defense. I sit in rooms with the top brass, the real decision makers, not the grunts." He laughed, a harsh grating sound that bounced off the high walls. "You think those little ribbons mean anything in the real world? They do not. So what are you anyway? Some low-level Captain A desk jockey major." He tilted his head. A cruel mocking sneer twisted his face. He was digging, trying to find the exposed nerve, trying to find the exact word that would make me break. "I bet you cried and scratched at the door just to get a desk job. Pushing papers around, pretending you matter. You are nothing but a bottom feeder living off the government dime." Jasmine let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She crossed her arms, looking at me with pure triumph. She thought her husband was burying me. She thought he was tearing down the last walls of my defense. The cousins in the back started to smile again. The natural order of their little suburban kingdom was being restored. The wealthy lawyer was crushing the blue-collar soldier. That was how the script was supposed to go. I let him finish. I did not interrupt him. You never interrupt an enemy when they are busy making a fatal mistake. I watched the absolute certainty in his eyes. He was so proud of himself. He really thought he held all the cards. He thought he was the apex predator in the room. He had no idea he had just walked blindfolded into a minefield. He willingly put his own neck right on the chopping block. I did not speak another word. I acted. Words are the fragile weapons of politicians, cowards, and corporate lawyers. I do not deal in words. I deal in kinetic force. I deal in absolute, undeniable reality. I pushed my shoulders off the wall. I stepped out of the shadows of the corner and stood at full attention. The shift in my posture was not a casual civilian movement. It was a precise drilled execution of military discipline. The heavy pressed wool of my dress blues settled perfectly over my frame, creating a sudden invisible gravity that pressed down on the entire room. The polished brass buttons on my chest gleamed under the expensive recessed lighting of the vaulted ceiling. I wore regulation combat-soled dress boots. They gave me an extra inch of height. Ethan was not a tall man to begin with, despite his massive ego. When I pulled my spine completely straight and locked my knees, I looked down at him. I had half a head on him. My shadow stretched across the polished hardwood floor, creeping up the front of his bespoke charcoal suit. It swallowed him completely. The air pressure in the living room suddenly multiplied. The oxygen became heavy, thick, unbreathable. I locked my eyes dead onto his pupils. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I gave him the exact same hollow, dead-eyed stare I used when evaluating a hostile grid coordinate before calling for heavy artillery. It is a look that strips away all human empathy. It evaluates the meat and bones standing in front of it and calculates the most efficient, ruthless way to reduce it to ash. Ethan felt it. The smug, arrogant smirk melted right off his face. His jaw muscles went completely slack. The primal lizard part of his brain recognized that he had just kicked a sleeping predator, and the predator was now fully awake. Right at that exact second, a short, sharp vibration punched against my ribs. Buzz! The encrypted Pentagon device resting in my breast pocket. One single pulse. It was the confirmation signal from my lead intelligence officer. The corporate files on Ethan's law firm, including the complete status of their Department of Defense bidding, had just landed on my secure desk. The trap was officially sprung. The heavy steel blade of the guillotine was raised. All I had to do was let it drop. I opened my mouth. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to shout to dominate the space. Colonel Sophie Lewis, I said. The words hit the hardwood floor like solid blocks of lead. Heavy, crushing, unforgiving. The ambient noise in the massive living room completely shattered. The soft, pretentious jazz music bleeding from the hidden ceiling speakers suddenly sounded choked and distorted. The group of cousins who had been laughing and pointing just seconds ago physically took a step backward. Their eyes went wide with sudden gripping terror. Absolute horror washed over their faces. Commander of Strategic Task Force 132. I finished. The silence that followed was absolute. It was deafening. The title was not just a job description, it was a weapon of mass destruction in their corporate world. Full-bird colonel. A rank that commands thousands of Marines. A rank that dictates the movement of entire battle groups across continents. A rank that holds absolute, unquestionable power over life and death. And more importantly to the greedy parasites standing in this room, it held absolute power over the money. Over by the fireplace, I heard a sharp gasp. My mother dropped her porcelain saucer. It clattered against the glass coffee table. Jasmine stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, the cruel mockery wiped completely clean from her heavily made-up face. I turned my focus back to the target. I watched the physiology of a man completely break down in real time. The blood rushed out of Ethan's face so fast he looked like a fresh corpse. The dark red flush of his arrogant anger vanished, replaced by a sickly, translucent white. His lungs forgot how to work. He opened his mouth, gasping for air, but his chest did not rise. His breathing stuttered into short, pathetic wheezes. His right hand began to shake violently. The fine motor skills in his fingers completely failed him. The crystal wine glass tilted in his weak grip. He did not even notice. Several thick drops of dark red Pinot Noir spilled over the delicate rim. They splattered directly onto the toe of his polished, expensive leather shoes. The dark stains looked exactly like fresh blood. I watched the gears in his mind grind together until they sparked and caught fire. He was a defense contractor lawyer. He knew the players. He knew the board. He knew exactly what those words meant. Strategic Task Force 132. It was not just a random military unit. It was the exact name stamped in bold black ink at the top of the $500 million defense bid his firm had been aggressively chasing for the past 6 months. It was the massive contract that was supposed to make him a senior partner. It was the deal he built his entire arrogant identity around. He had been begging, bribing, and bleeding for a single signature of approval. He had just spent the last 5 minutes publicly mocking the military career of the exact person who held absolute veto power over his entire existence. Ethan's knees buckled, just a fraction of an inch, but I saw it. The bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He was looking at the executioner, and he realized he had just handed me the axe. I tilted my head, studying his pale, sweating face with cold, clinical precision. "Are you ready to discuss my desk job now, Ethan?" Ethan took a step back. His polished leather heel caught on the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He stumbled, his knees gave out. Just a fraction, but enough. He caught himself, but the damage was done. His body reacted before his brain could process the reality. Primitive survival instinct taking over the corporate shell. He pulled his feet together, his shoulders slumped forward. He was a civilian, a man who charged $800 an hour to argue in air-conditioned boardrooms. But right now, standing in front of me, his body folded into a pathetic, broken imitation of military submission. The crystal glass in his hand shook violently. More dark red wine sloshed over the rim. It splattered onto the floor. It soaked into the expensive rug, leaving a dark, permanent stain. He did not care. He could not drag his eyes away from my face. He opened his mouth. His jaw worked up and down, but no sound came out. His throat was completely dry. He looked like a fish thrown onto hot concrete. Ma'am. The word scraped out of his throat. It sounded like heavy grit. It was barely a whisper, but in the dead silence of the living room, it rang out like a gunshot. I did not know, Ethan stammered. His chest heaved rapidly. He was suffocating on his own arrogance. I did not know the commander of the task force was you. He looked at the brass buttons on my uniform. He looked at the ribbons. 10 minutes ago, he called this a cheap blue suit. Now that same suit was the heavy steel vault locking away his $500 million defense contract. His entire career. His fast track to senior partner. The foundation of this massive house and the leased sports cars sitting in the driveway. It was all resting in the palm of my hand, and he had just spent the afternoon spitting on it. I did not move. I kept my hands firmly clasped behind my back. I watched him drown in his own making. Over in the corner near the marble fireplace, the silence broke. Uncle Robert. He was furiously swiping his thick fingers across the screen of an iPad. The bright blue light reflected off his glasses. He stopped. His eyes went wide. He looked up from the screen, staring at me like I had just crawled out of a grave. "Oh my God," Robert breathed. His voice shook. "The Department of Defense press release. From last week. She was just decorated. She's running a whole division." The words rippled through the crowd. You could actually see the physical shift in the room. The flock of wealthy relatives, the people who had just been laughing at my expense, began to move. They stepped backward, one by one. They created a wide, empty circle around Ethan and Jasmine. They looked at the golden couple like they were suddenly carrying a highly infectious disease. In their world, losing money and losing status was a terminal illness, and Ethan was infected. Jasmine felt the shift. She looked around. She saw her perfect suburban audience backing away. The carefully constructed facade of her life was cracking down the middle. She panicked. She reached out and grabbed Ethan by the sleeve of his bespoke suit. Her manicured nails dug into the expensive gray wool. The heavy, sweet smell of her designer perfume mixed with the sour, metallic smell of Ethan's nervous sweat. The thick layer of makeup on her face was starting to smear around the edges. "Ethan, what is wrong with you?" Jasmine demanded. Her voice was shrill, desperate. "So what if she is a colonel who cares about a Department of Defense press release? She is still just Sophie. She is just wearing a uniform. Do not let her talk to you like that in our house." She was completely clueless. She lived her entire life on social media and credit cards. She did not understand how power actually worked. She thought she could just yell at the problem until it went away. She thought she could still bully the girl who used to sit quietly at the dinner table. She yanked on his arm again. Ethan snapped. He spun around. The violent motion ripped his sleeve out of her grip. The heavy gold watch on his wrist flashed under the lights. The thick veins in his neck popped, standing out against his pale, sweating skin. The terror in his chest immediately mutated into blind, explosive rage. "Shut your mouth, Jasmine!" he roared. He did not care who was watching. He did not care about the caterers or the corporate partners. He unloaded every single ounce of his fear directly onto his wife. The volume of his voice hit her like a physical slap. Jasmine flinched hard. She dropped her wine glass. It hit the hardwood floor and shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. She stood dead still. Her bottom lip trembled uncontrollably. The silk fabric of her designer dress rustled as she shivered. The zipper on the back of the dress gave a faint, tight squeak. Her eyes darted around the room. She looked for someone to step in. She looked over at the white leather sofa for our mother to defend her. But our mother was just sitting there staring at the floor, clutching her cold coffee cup. She looked for the cousins to comfort her. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. They just stared. The throne was destroyed. The undisputed queen of the family had just been publicly humiliated and crushed by the very man who bought her the crown. I stood perfectly still. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched. I watched this perfect, flawless family turn on each other like a pack of starving dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. They did not love each other. They never did. They only loved the comfort of their delusion. And the second real, undeniable power stepped into the room, the delusion shattered into a million pieces. If you ever felt satisfied seeing your bully exposed by the truth, hit like on this video. Leave a comment saying karma if you believe ignorant arrogance always pays a heavy price. The heavy white leather sofa groaned. My mother lost her footing and stumbled forward. She caught herself on the edge of the glass coffee table. The porcelain cup she had dropped earlier clattered sharply against the thick glass. She pushed herself up. She reached both hands out toward me. Her fingers were trembling so violently that the heavy gold rings on her knuckles clicked together. She looked at me. Her eyes were wide, panicked, and searching. But she was not looking at her daughter. She was looking at a massive defense contract. She was looking at sheer, unfiltered power. She realized she had just treated a gold mine like a stray dog, and she was desperate to dig it back out of the trash. "Sophie," my mother whispered. Her voice cracked. She blinked rapidly, trying to force a tear to the surface, but her eyes remained completely dry. "Why did you never tell me? If I had known you held a position like this? If I had known you were commanding people, I would have." "You would have what?" I cut her off. I did not yell. I did not have to. The living room was so dead silent that my flat, empty voice carried to every single corner. "You would have let me stand near the casket at the cemetery. You would have let your country club friends see my uniform without feeling embarrassed." She flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She opened her mouth, but the excuse died in her dry throat. A family that only shows love when a member puts on a display of wealth and power is not a family, I said. My words dropped like heavy stones. That is a commercial transaction, and your account is completely empty. The words hit her right in the chest. Her knees buckled. She fell backward, collapsing hard onto the white leather cushion. She stared blankly at the floor. Her hands fell limp into her lap. She had nothing left to sell. I shifted my gaze. I found Jasmine. My sister was pressing her back hard against the edge of the heavy oak dining table. She was trying to shrink, trying to make herself invisible. The loud, arrogant suburban queen from 10 minutes ago was completely gone. She clutched her stomach, breathing in short, panicked gasps. The heavy, expensive silk of her designer dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. I walked toward her, slow, deliberate. The thick rubber soles of my military boots absorbed the sound of my footsteps, but she watched me approach like I was a firing squad. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from her. I invaded her space. The sharp smell of her fear cut right through her expensive floral perfume. She looked up at me. The thick black mascara on her eyelashes was already running down her cheeks, mixing with a layer of cold sweat. "You built this entire house of cards on my blood," I said. I kept my voice low, forcing her to lean in and listen to the terms of her own execution. "You took my hazard pay, the combat money I earned sitting in the dirt while mortar shells leveled the concrete bunkers around me. You took every single dime of it to pay Dad's hospital bills. Then you took the credit. You stood around telling everyone how much money you spent. You played the perfect, wealthy, devoted daughter." Jasmine shook her head violently. No. Sophie, please. You looked at this uniform today and you felt disgusted. I continued ignoring her pathetic pleading. You mocked it because you thought it meant I was poor. You thought I was a failure because I do not work in a glass office. You live your entire life begging for attention from people who do not even care if you breathe. You exist entirely on cheap optics and social media likes. I leaned forward, just an inch. The polished brass buttons on my dress blues caught the overhead light. I do not care about optics, I whispered, making sure she heard every single syllable. I decide who gets to keep living. The surgical strike landed. The fragile fake reality she built for herself shattered into dust. Her knees hit the expensive Persian rug with a dull thud. She wrapped her arms around her head, buried her face in her knees, and started to cry. It was not the delicate, polite crying she used at the funeral to get sympathy. It was an ugly, guttural sob. The raw sound of pure, absolute humiliation. Her shoulders heaved violently under the black silk. She gasped for air, choking on her own spit. The zipper on the back of her dress strained and squeaked as she curled into a tight, miserable ball on the floor. She waited for someone to help her. She waited for Ethan to reach down and pull her up. He did not move. He was too busy staring at the dark wine stain on his leather shoes, paralyzed by his own ruined future. She waited for her wealthy cousins. She waited for the corporate partners. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody said a word. They just watched her break. The crowd had completely abandoned her. In their world, weakness is a disease, and they did not want to catch it. I stood over her. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no sorrow. Just the cold, clean satisfaction of watching a parasite finally detach from the host. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for years simply evaporated. I turned my back on them. I turned my back on the white leather sofa, the crying woman on the rug, and the sweating corporate lawyer. I looked across the empty space they had created in the center of the room. My eyes found the faded black suit and the silver veteran lapel pin. Ethan scrambled. He actually scrambled. He pushed off the expensive Persian rug, his polished leather shoes slipping on the dark, wet puddle of spilled wine. He lunged into my path, completely abandoning whatever miserable shred of corporate dignity he had left. He threw both his hands up, pressing his soft, manicured palms together, right in front of his chest. He looked exactly like a man begging for a stay of execution in front of a firing squad. "Colonel Lewis!" Ethan gasped. The arrogant, booming voice from 10 minutes ago was completely burned out. He sounded like a panicked, breathless child. "Please, that defense contract. It is the absolute lifeline of my firm. We leveraged everything. If we lose that bid, I lose the company. I lose the house. You cannot just..." I did not blink. I did not break my stride. I kept walking forward. I moved right past him, forcing him to stumble backward and sideways just to avoid getting his expensive suit trampled by my combat boots. I looked right through him. He was not a human being anymore. He was just a piece of trash blowing across a dirty highway. You do not stop to argue with trash. You do not negotiate with a parasite. You just step over it and keep moving. His fate was already sealed in concrete. I knew it. He knew it. My signature was never going to touch his paperwork. A man who folds and begs the second he faces real pressure has absolutely no business handling government military assets. I left him standing there, choking on the stale air-conditioned air, his hands still pressed together in a useless, empty prayer. I set my eyes on the heavy oak front door. It was time to leave this graveyard of fake smiles and borrowed money. Then the crowd of silent, terrified relatives shifted. They parted ways, shrinking back against the walls and the expensive furniture. They did not want to be anywhere near the center of the room. An old man stepped into the open gap. Master Sergeant Miller. He did not look like the old, tired man who walked into this house an hour ago. The heavy, defeated slope of his shoulders was gone. The arthritis in his joints seemed to completely vanish, replaced by the sheer force of pure willpower. He pulled his spine into a perfectly straight, rigid line. He walked right through the middle of the room, completely ignoring the sobbing woman curled on the floor and the ruined lawyer clutching his own chest. He stopped dead exactly 3 paces in front of me. We stood there, 2 soldiers, 2 entirely different generations of war. surrounded by a room full of empty, hollow parasites who had never bled for a single thing in their entire lives. The faded black fabric of his cheap, outdated suit stood in sharp, jarring contrast to the crisp, dark blue wool of my uniform. But in that exact moment, we were the only two real people in the building. Miller shifted his weight. Thud. The hard leather heel of his right shoe slammed down against the polished hardwood floor. The sound cracked through the dead silence of the living room like a rifle shot. His right arm snapped up. The movement was sharp, violent, forged by decades of muscle memory drilled into his bones on black asphalt and burning sand. His hand cut through the air with a faint, audible swoosh. His fingers locked perfectly straight, thumbs tucked tight. The tip of his middle finger rested just a fraction of an inch from the edge of his right eyebrow. A flawless textbook Marine Corps salute. He was not looking at the ribbons on my chest. He was not looking at the silver eagle pinned to my collar. He was looking directly into my eyes. He was offering the absolute highest level of respect a soldier could give. He was validating every single drop of blood, every freezing night in the dirt, and every piece of my soul I left buried in the desert. "Honor to welcome you home, Colonel," Miller said. His voice was deep, gritty. It rolled out of his chest like a rolling wave of thunder echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. It completely drowned out the pathetic, wet sobbing coming from Jasmine on the floor. It was a voice built for shouting commands over the deafening scream of incoming mortar fire. I stopped. I planted my boots firm against the floor. I pulled my shoulders back. I expanded my chest, letting the heavy brass buttons of my jacket catch the bright overhead light. I raised my right arm, slower than his, but just as sharp, just as precise. I brought my hand up and returned the salute. I held it there. The contrast in the room was brutal, absolutely merciless. My own blood relatives were entirely broken. My sister was curled in a miserable weeping ball on an expensive rug, crying over her shattered social status. My mother was slumped on a white leather sofa, paralyzed by the loss of her financial leverage. My brother-in-law was covered in spilled wine, hyperventilating in the corner. They shared my DNA, but they were absolute strangers. They were cowards. The only person in this entire zip code who actually saw me, who actually understood the heavy weight of the uniform on my back, was an old man with no blood connection to me at all. He never asked me for a dime. He never asked me for a favor. He just offered absolute, unwavering respect. I dropped my hand. I snapped my arm back down to my side, the fabric pulling tight across my back. I looked at the old veteran. For the first time since I stepped off that airplane, the tight, cold muscles in my face finally relaxed. The heavy block of ice in my chest cracked right down the middle. I smiled at him. Just a small, quiet smile. A silent, unspoken agreement between two people who actually knew what it meant to survive the fire. Miller gave a single firm nod. I wiped the smile off my face. The ice returned. I turned my back on the wreckage. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my sister. I walked straight toward the heavy oak door. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the cold brass handle. I shoved the heavy oak door open. It swung wide, the brass hinges groaning loudly in the quiet night. The sharp, freezing air of the evening hit my face like a physical blow. It felt clean. It rushed past me into the foyer, violently ripping through the stale, suffocating cloud of Jasmine's expensive floral perfume and Ethan's sour, nervous sweat. I did not pause. I did not look back. I stepped over the threshold and let the massive door slam shut behind me. The heavy thud shook the door frame. It echoed off the brick exterior. A final concrete period at the end of a very long, very ugly sentence. I walked down the long driveway. The crushed gravel crunched loudly under the thick rubber soles of my combat boots. A steady, disciplined rhythm. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Inside that massive, overpriced suburban mansion, a fake empire was burning to the ground. I could still hear the faint, muffled sounds bleeding through the thick glass windows. Ethan was likely still hyperventilating on the Persian rug, staring at the dark wine stain on his expensive shoes. Jasmine was probably still sobbing into her silk dress, mourning the sudden death of her social status. My mother was sitting on the white leather sofa, paralyzed, calculating exactly how much leverage she'd just thrown into the garbage. I did not care. They were ghosts. They were white noise. They no longer existed on my grid. I reached the end of the driveway. My matte black SUV sat parked under the dim, flickering glow of a street lamp. The truck was covered in a thin layer of highway dust, a sharp contrast to the leased luxury sports cars sitting perfectly clean in the driveway behind me. The cold metal of the door handle felt solid and real in my grip. Deep in my breast pocket, my phone vibrated. 2 short, sharp bursts. I pulled it out. The bright screen cut through the darkness, illuminating the brass buttons on my chest. It was a secure text from my lead aide back at the Pentagon. Defense contract files for firm 132 are prepped. Tactical committee is standing by for your cancellation order first thing tomorrow morning. I stared at the glowing green text. $500 million. An entire corporate legacy, a lifetime of arrogant posturing, ready to be wiped completely off the map with a single stroke of my pen. I tapped the screen with my thumb. 2 words, copy that. I hit send. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I pulled the heavy driver's side door open. Before getting in, I reached up and carefully removed my white cover. I held it with both hands, respecting the heavy brass emblem pinned to the front, and set it gently on the passenger seat. This empty, superficial suburb was not my home. It never was. The front line was my home. The people who actually bled beside me in the dirt were my true family. I slid behind the steering wheel. The cold leather cracked slightly under my weight. I shoved the steel key into the ignition and twisted it hard. The heavy V8 engine caught instantly. It let out a deep, guttural roar that rattled the loose change in the center console. The heavy mechanical vibration traveled up the steering column and straight into my bones. It grounded me. It reminded me of the rumbling armored transports crossing the desert floor. The dashboard lights flared to life, casting a harsh red tactical glow across the dark cabin. The radio kicked on automatically. An AM station broadcasting late into the night. Static hissed violently through the speakers for a few seconds before a low, steady voice broke through the white noise. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Psalm 23, verse 4. The broadcaster spoke slowly, deliberately. He let the heavy ancient words hang in the freezing air inside the truck. I will fear no evil. I gripped the steering wheel. The thick leather felt rough against the calluses on my palms. I looked up at the rearview mirror. I could see the massive dark silhouette of the house sitting in the distance. They really thought they could break me. They thought their silent treatments, their cheap insults, and their fake superiority could bury me. They thought they could leave me alone in the dark. A slow, cold smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. They forgot one fundamental rule of warfare. You cannot use the dark to threaten a person who already owns it. I pulled the shifter down. The heavy transmission locked into drive with a solid clunk. I pressed my heavy boot down on the gas pedal. The SUV lurched forward, the thick tires biting hard into the cold asphalt. The twin beams of the headlights snapped on, violently slicing the pitch-black night in half. The bright white light carved a clear, straight path down the empty suburban road. I survived the mortar fire in the Middle East. I survived the freezing nights in the concrete bunkers. And tonight I finally burned down the most vicious, ruthless battlefield of all. Blood ties. The chains were completely gone. The heavy, suffocating debt of being the family scapegoat simply evaporated into the exhaust fumes trailing behind my truck. Tomorrow morning, I would wake up, put on my uniform, and end a corrupt lawyer's career. Nobody could drain me anymore. Nobody could judge me. I was a ghost to them, and they were dead to me. I pressed the accelerator harder to the floor. The V8 roared louder, drowning out the past, drowning out the fake smiles, drowning out every single miserable memory of that house. I drove straight into the black night. I was finally undeniably free. The most ruthless punishment for toxic people is living a great life they can never reach. Hit like and subscribe to the channel today. Leave a comment saying, "Freedom," if you are ready to cut off the dead weight of family burdens and step into your own power.